Law for Life, the podcast, with Franklin Solicitors.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Law for Life, the Franklin Solicitors podcast, and it's great to be joined in the studio once again from the employment law team at Franklin's by Georgia Harris. Hello, Georgia.
Good morning, how are you?
Great. Now, today we're going to be talking about an aspect of employment law which has changed recently. The new Employment Rights Act has kicked in, and once again, as an employer, it feels like the goalposts are constantly moving, so we need to kind of reset where we stand in terms of employing people and running a business with the area of harassment. Mm-hmm. So this is going to be quite a complicated one, I imagine. So let's start off with a definition. What actually legally is harassment?
So harassment is a claim that can be brought to an employment tribunal, and we have a statutory definition under Section 26 of the Equality Act. There's actually 3 definitions within that piece of legislation, but I'm just going to focus on the main ones today. Okay. So it tells us that so one individual harasses another where they engage in unwanted conduct, and where we're talking about sexual harassment, it's unwanted conduct of a sexual nature, or if it's harassment related to something else, then it's unwanted conduct related to a protected characteristic, and that unwanted conduct gives the effect of either violating that person's dignity or creating a hostile, intimidating, degrading, offensive, bit of a mouthful, or humiliating environment.
Okay, I mean, that seems straightforward, but I guess a lot of those are matters of judgment and interpretation of what counts as degrading and what counts as humiliating, and I think it's a tricky one to navigate, and I guess it gets kind of tested out in cases, and case law kind of gets brought into play here of examples of where things have been thrown out because it's not deemed severe enough, or where it's kind of set a benchmark for what actually counts. It's
really tricky, and I think it's one of those areas which, of course, the employee that's going through that thing, it's a really difficult thing to have to go through, and of course so important for employers to get right. When it goes through a tribunal, of course it's on a case-by-case basis, but yeah, it's really tricky.
Okay, so prior to the Employment Rights Act, what were the legislation and the protections available for employees?
So we have 3 sort of main headings under the Equality Act. 2 of them I have sort of covered in that definition. So we've got protection from harassment related to a protected characteristic. So if you think about the Equality Act, and probably more people think sort of about discrimination more generally, there are certain characteristics which are protected under the legislation. So think age, sex, disability, race, those sorts of things. So harassment which relates to those specific characteristics will be covered under the legislation. We've of course got sexual harassment, which, as I mentioned, is unwanted conduct related to conduct of a sexual nature. Yeah. And then we've got less favourable treatment related to as a result of harassment as well. So if you think, for example, if somebody was propositioned and they turned that advancement down and then they suffered some form of detriment or unfavourable treatment as a result. Okay. We've also got a new duty that came in actually back in October 2024, which is also a protection there in place for employees, which imposed a sort of proactive duty on employers to try and sort of reduce the likelihood of sexual harassment in the workplace. So it's a duty for them to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment as well. There are some sort of ancillary claims which are sort of a step aside from employment law. There's the Protection of Harassment Act as well, but those are sort of the main protections in place for employees.
This is such a big topic. And I think you could do a podcast about a lot of these aspects separately, because
Absolutely.
What counts as a reasonable step to prevent sexual harassment happening in the workplace? What kind of safeguards should you have in place in your workplace? And I think it's always worth getting some advice on some of these areas, because it seems like a bit of a minefield.
Absolutely, and I think with the changes that are coming in, it's just going to get even more complicated. So definitely first step, if you're unsure, is to come and take some legal advice.
Yeah. So was that the Worker Protection Act that brought in that addition?
Yeah, the new duty. Yeah, it's known as sort of the prevention duty to prevent sexual harassment.
Okay. So assume we've got our head around all of that. Now the Employment Rights Act comes along, and there's extra extra responsibilities brought in from that, aren't there?
Yes, so there's three main changes that are being brought about to harassment legislation. The first is actually in respect of whistleblowing, but it sort of goes alongside harassment for our purposes today. So whistleblowing, for anybody that doesn't know, essentially it's where somebody discloses information, some sort of wrongdoing, and it's in the public interest. So that's really what whistleblowing is. And there's a set sort of prescribed list of sorts of information that will fall within that legislation and will be protected. Now, at the moment, sexual harassment isn't within that prescribed list, and that's what the Employment Rights Act does. It adds sexual harassment to that list. Now, in practice, whether that's actually going to make a big change, we'll have to wait and see, because obviously there's lots of things which are already on that list, which sexual harassment may well have already sort of been deemed to fall within. But that's one change that actually has come about already.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you can talk about other people being sexual harassed if it's whistleblowing, so it doesn't need to be the victim that's reporting it. It could be somebody else in the workplace thinking this is unacceptable. That person isn't going to stand up and say something, but I think this isn't something that should be got away with. Yeah,
absolutely correct. Yeah, it doesn't have to be the person themselves that makes that report.
Okay, and what other changes are being brought about by the Employment Rights Act?
Yes, so we've got two other really big changes that are coming in later this year. The first is in respect of that duty that I already mentioned, that prevention duty in relation to sexual harassment. So at the moment, that duty is to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. That's now changing to take all reasonable steps. So potentially quite a significant change for employers, and difficult really in practice to know really what that means. So that change is coming about later this year.
So basically, previously you could take some reasonable steps, do a few things, but now if there's a reasonable step that you haven't taken, then that can come back to bite you.
It's really tricky right now to know really what the scope of that change is going to look like, and I think really we'll need to wait until we see probably some case law to know really what it means in practice. But absolutely right, in theory, if they haven't taken all reasonable steps that they potentially could have done, then they may well be caught by that change.
That seems like quite a broad definition, because it's very difficult to think of everything you could possibly ever think of, and you could make 100 changes, and then somebody could think of one thing that you haven't thought of and say, oh, you didn't take all reasonable steps. So I don't know, it just seems very
a big
broad.
change, yeah, absolutely. And I think of course the thing to remember is that it has to still be a reasonable step, so you couldn't necessarily suggest something which would be completely outrageous and then it would still be caught. But yeah, it's definitely a big change.
Okay, and this is the interesting one, that now it's not just employees that you're responsible for, it's everybody.
Yes, so the third change is in relation to third parties. So we actually did previously have some legislation which covered employers' liability for third-party harassment, but it actually got repealed some time ago, back in 2013. So this just reintroduces that duty for employers. And what that change is essentially is that an employer can't permit a third party to harass their employees, and they will be culpable for that harassment if they haven't taken all reasonable steps to prevent it. So it sounds quite similar to the duty that we just mentioned as well, but yes, now it expands to third parties as well.
So that relates to third parties harassing your employees. What about your employees being the ones that are guilty of the harassment to somebody else that isn't working for your company? Is there any protection about that?
Well, employers, of course, have the ability to bring sort of disciplinary proceedings against their employees if they believe they've acted in a way that is sort of misconduct. And I think certainly that would be something which they would want to do in that circumstance, particularly, of course, if their customers or clients are thinking that they are perhaps going to no longer work with the business because of that. Of course, there would be steps that they would need to take in order to go through that disciplinary process. So they would need to investigate it properly and decide on obviously what the sanction was at the end of a disciplinary process. But yes.
Okay, cool. So What will employers need to do differently with the enhanced protection?
It's tricky right now to say, really, because exactly as we spoke about earlier, we don't know really in practice what the scope of it is going to look like. We don't have any additional regulations or guidance on what that enhanced duty is going to look like. So I think in the first instance, really, we need to wait to see what that guidance looks like. And I think the biggest part of it is understanding what more employers need to do beyond what they are already doing. Of course, they already have that duty to take reasonable steps in respect of their sexual harassment. So we need to gain a bit of an understanding as to what more they could be doing. There is some guidance from the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which is already published, which actually relates really to the duties which are already in place, but it can be a helpful starting point. It talks about 8 steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So that's definitely something which I would signpost people towards as a starting point. And I think also taking legal advice to understand really what the risks are for your particular business, to understand what sort of things you could be doing moving forwards to prepare.
Yeah, that sounds like a very good idea, because I think it's the kind of thing that if you don't have the right advice, you could just be stumbling around making bad choices and not necessarily doing everything that you should be doing. So I think, getting a professional to help you with this stuff is probably a good idea.
And protecting your staff is fundamental to your business, and it's such an important thing to get right.
Well, exactly. I think we're worrying more about the legal ramifications rather than the reason for this in the first place, which is just looking after your staff, which is the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Okay, when do these changes kick in?
So the first change that I mentioned in respect of whistleblowing has actually already come in. So that came into effect on the 6th of April earlier this year. The other 2 changes that are due to come in are supposed to be coming in October 2026, but we don't have a specific date as yet. And I do understand that there's the regulations that I mentioned would potentially be helpful for us to give us some more guidance. I understand that there are some regulations that are due to come in, but interestingly, they're not due to come in until after the changes take place. So I think that will be interesting, but it's due to come in October.
So do you think employers will need to be ready for that and make these changes prior to October, not just kind of think, oh no, this is kicked in now, we need to start doing things differently?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's obviously certain things which, from sort of a practical perspective, they could be doing to help sort of push them more and show that they're taking those reasonable steps. So there's certain things which I think would be really helpful. So doing risk assessments as a first step to understand really what those risks are. And I think doing them for particular roles where you think those risks are going to be greater. So where you've got, if we think about a pub, for example, those people that are working in front of house roles, maybe behind the bar, in terms of that third party harassment element, they're probably much more likely to be at risk than somebody perhaps who is working in the kitchen, for example, because they don't have that face-to-face conduct with their clients. So I think conducting risk assessments which are relevant for the roles that you have in your business is going to be a good first step. I think taking action plans off the back of those risk assessments is going to be really helpful. And then the sort of standard things which you would expect, so training your staff, making sure that you've got policies in place which people have read and understood and actually work in practice. And I think reporting mechanisms is so important as well. So if something does happen, people know what to do and who to go to. Yeah,
so important. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Hopefully that's given everybody an overview, but as you say, the best thing to just make sure that you're compliant as it applies to your business is just to get some personal advice, and the team at Franklin's are here to help you with that kind of thing, aren't they?
Yeah, so we regularly advise on sort of policies and things like that surrounding harassment, equal opportunities, as well as advising on particular circumstances. So if you want to know really what your business needs to be doing and it's bespoke for you, then absolutely we can help.
Yeah, I think, get it all done in one go and just look at the bigger picture and just make sure that everything that you're doing as a business is all being done correctly.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Thank you for giving us that insight, Georgia.
That's okay. Thank you for having me.